In the annals of human history, few names evoke the sheer horror and sorrow that Auschwitz does. This infamous concentration camp holds secrets that the passage of time cannot bury. Beyond the staggering statistics and the haunting images lies a lesser-known narrative, one that delves deep into the tragic fate of the countless souls who perished within its confines. Auschwitz, more than just a place of death, was the epicenter of a systematic attempt to erase human identity and dignity. Between 1939 and 1945, 1.3 million people were sent to Auschwitz, with an estimated 1.1 million dying during their captivity. Some were gassed, some were shot, many were worked to death, and some of the most unfortunate found themselves the subjects of cruel medical experimentation. Of the 1.3 million, over 1 million were Jewish. The rest, roughly 200,000, were made up of Poles, Soviet prisoners of war, homosexuals, Roma people, people with mental disabilities, and a small number of violent career criminals. The stories of the bodies of Auschwitz, the silent witnesses to unspeakable atrocities, reveal a chilling reality of the Nazi regime's inhumanity and the cold, industrial scale of their final solution. For countless individuals, the journey to Auschwitz was one of fear, uncertainty, and despair. Victims were forcibly transported to the camp by train, often packed into overcrowded cattle cars with little access to food or water. The grueling journey could last for days or even weeks, subjecting prisoners to extreme physical and emotional hardships. The carriages were overcrowded and unventilated, causing many to collapse or even die from heat and exhaustion, and they would often go the whole journey without any access to proper food. Upon arrival at Auschwitz, prisoners were immediately confronted with the brutal reality of their new existence. They were stripped of their belongings and subjected to dehumanizing procedures, such as head shaving and tattooing. Families were torn apart as men, women, and children were separated into different groups, sometimes never seeing each other again. All newcomers were asked questions about their age, occupation, and health by a waiting SS doctor. The answers to these 3 questions would decide their fate. Those deemed useful were forced to work themselves to death. The less fortunate were sent directly to the gas chambers, with a small few chosen to be the subjects of brutal Nazi medical experimentation. The gas chambers. The gas chambers are perhaps the most notorious aspect of the final solution. They are physical evidence of the immense effort the Nazi Party was willing to put into exterminating those they deemed inferior. Those deemed unfit for work were sent directly to the gas chambers. Those able to walk marched the 2.5 kilometers from the train stop to the gas chambers, while those too infirm were taken by truck. A van flying the Red Cross followed the inmates in an attempt to keep them calm, but in reality, this vehicle carried the deadly Zyklon B that would eventually suffocate them. The SS guards accompanying them kept them unaware of their fate, and victims were told that they were being deloused or disinfected prior to entering the main camp. After fully undressing, the unsuspecting prisoners were herded into the small sealed room of the gas chamber. They were packed in tight, and the gas chambers were capable of killing as many as 2,000 people at a time. Zyklon B, a deadly cyanide-based pesticide, would be funneled into the overcrowded room. Panic would set in as people realized what was happening, but this only quickened the process, causing them to asphyxiate even faster. When the execution was complete and the gas had dissipated, members of the Sonderkommando would remove the bodies and prepare the chamber for the next round of killings. The Sonderkommandos, prisoners forced to work for the Nazi death machine, would then shave the bodies and remove any gold or silver dental fillings. Dental fillings would be melted down and reused in order to provide SS members with good dental care, while human hair would be used for textiles, rope and cordage, mattress stuffing, and even the ignition systems of bombs. When the mass extermination of prisoners began in 1942, the bodies of the victims were buried in mass graves in and around the camp. Halfway through the year, when the number of transports of prisoners to Auschwitz grew significantly, it was decided that a more effective method was required. 5 crematoria were built and were connected directly to the gas chambers. These 5 crematoria, according to camp documentation, could burn as many as 4,756 corpses per day. However, survivors ordered to work the crematorium claimed it could burn as many as 8,000. Bodies would be burnt mostly to ash, and the hard bone that remained would be crushed either by hand or by a specialist bone-crushing machine. The ash and bone fragments were disposed of in various ways. much of it being dumped into nearby rivers. Some of the bone ash was used as fertilizer for the camp farm and as an additive to the camp compost heap. The ashes were also used for construction, being used as the base for the building of roads and foundations, or filling out depressions in the ground to level it for construction projects. Medical experimentation. Those deemed to be interesting medical specimens were selected for experimentation and sent to live in Block 10. The experiments were conducted for various aims. Some were an attempt to discover and invent new battlefield medicine, others to encourage the birth of healthy and racially pure German children, while many were for nothing more than the macabre curiosity. Josef Mengele, perhaps the most infamous Nazi doctor, conducted his experiments on sets of identical twins. Mengele used Auschwitz as a way to continue his pre-war studies into genetics, and his experiments showed absolutely no consideration for the victim's physical or mental well-being. In his twin experiments, he would infect one twin with a deadly disease, transfusing blood from one twin to another, and even amputating healthy limbs. In one extreme case, Mengele would attempt to sew a pair of twins together in an attempt to create conjoined twins. Those with dwarfism were also a favorite of Mengele. Members of the Auschwitz family, a large family of 12 Hungarian Jews, all of whom were dwarves, would have blood taken from behind their ears and fingers multiple times a day, and one was killed and his body boiled so the bones could be put on display in a museum. Amazingly, most of the family would live to see the liberation of Auschwitz. The Nazi Party was looking for new ways to heal its wounded soldiers and focused on the transplantation or regeneration of muscle, bone, and nerves. Subjects would have their nerve or muscles or even large amounts of bone surgically removed without anesthetic, with those who survived facing intense chronic pain, mutilation, and often permanent disability. Some of the experiments were used to discover new methods to sterilize people quickly and cheaply. The Nazi Party had a policy of sterilization for those deemed mentally and physically inferior, but was searching for ways to make the process quicker and cheaper. Horst Schumann's experiments tested the effects of X-rays on fertility. Both male and female prisoners, mainly Jewish and Romani, had their sexual organs placed in between two X-ray machines, which would then deliver massive amounts of radiation. After the trials, the genitals and ovaries would be dissected and sent to Breslau University for examination. While on trial for his wartime actions, Schumann would admit to being personally responsible for the death of at least 80,000 Jews. The Nazi Party kept an extensive record of its crimes. The camp overseers kept note of the numbers of inmates killed in the gas chambers and of the daily influx of new prisoners, while the doctors meticulously documented their brutal experiments and the effects of them. It was not until later in the war, when defeat was on the horizon, that there was an attempt to hide the crimes committed. The hasty retreat back into Germany as the Allied forces were fighting their way through Europe meant that the attempts to destroy evidence were often disturbed and incomplete. Much of the evidence for the Holocaust would come from the post-war trials of Nazi war criminals, most of whom would never deny the brutality of the concentration camps and the systematic murder within them. Most of the significant monuments to the terror committed at Auschwitz is the belongings left behind: 3,800 suitcases, 12,000 pots and pans, 40 cubic meters of shoes, and almost 2 tons of human hair. These items, now preserved by the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial, served as an eternal reminder of the inhumanity perpetuated at the site. The dismantling of Auschwitz. In 1944, Heinrich Himmler issued an order to dismantle the gas chambers at Auschwitz. The Sonderkommando were ordered to tear the buildings apart piece by piece. As the Red Army was closing in January of 1945, the remaining buildings were destroyed with explosives. Prisoners were then evacuated to concentration camps within Germany. 60,000 prisoners were forced to march hundreds of miles, passing through dozens of towns and villages in temperatures as low as minus 20 degrees Celsius. Many died of starvation and exhaustion along the way, while others were murdered by their captors in cold blood. Many made escape attempts, with most being hunted down and executed by the German guards. Those who did succeed sought refuge with sympathetic locals. Of the 60,000 men and women sent out from Auschwitz, only 45,000 would make it to their destination. Those that did survive were eventually loaded onto railway carts and transported deeper into the German territory and away from the advancing Allied armies so that the Nazi regime could continue their policy of extermination. The last concentration camp, Stutthof, would not be liberated until May of 1945. When the Allied armies liberated the concentration camps, they were faced with the full extent of the brutality of the Nazi ideology. Liberated prisoners were given food and medical care, but many were so emaciated and diseased that any amount of help was not enough to save them. The care of these prisoners proved very difficult for the American, British, and Soviet armies, with as many as 30,000 dying within weeks of liberation. Faced with the realities of the war, many German citizens claimed to have known nothing, even those living in towns and villages within only a few miles of the camps. Throughout the 1950s, there was little discussion of the camps within German society, and many Nazi doctors, some of whom had conducted cruel experiments or sterilized and euthanized innocent people, would work in the medical field well after the war. It would not be until the 1960s that Germany would face up to its dark past, and many of the former campsites were made into memorials and museums. Auschwitz serves as a somber reminder of the potential extent of human cruelty and of how so many otherwise ordinary people can be radicalized and turned into inhuman beasts.